You may have heard of seasonal affective disorder, or SAD, a form of clinical depression that results from a lack of sunshine. A perpetually gloomy geographical climate can negatively affect our mood and sometimes our physical well-being. A similar effect can be found in our interpersonal and working relationships. The prevailing climate in which our communication takes place, or the communication climate, affects how satisfied we feel about that relationship. Today we will focus on defining communication climate, identifying the communication patterns that define the climate, and finally discuss what this information means and how you can use it in your relationships. In 1961, Jack Gibb coined the phrase communication climate to describe the environment created by communicators which increases or decreases defensiveness. Another way to look at this is as the emotional tone of a relationship, which comes from the way people feel about and treat each other as they communicate with each other. In some relationships, we feel good. We feel valued, not threatened. It is a comfortable and supportive relationship. In others, however, we feel defensive or threatened. We perceive attacks on our self-concept and self-esteem. We feel personally diminished, and we tend to respond defensively, often falling victim to the fight or flight syndrome. We may want to flee by withdrawing from the situation, falling silent, physically removing ourselves, or becoming submissive. Typical fight responses include denying the potential validity of the attack. In other words, what was said may in fact be correct, but because we are defensive, we refuse to admit it, and sometimes argue even harder. We might also mount a counterattack under the belief that the best defense is a good offense. Jack Gibb uses these two terms, supportive and defensive, to describe the communication climate, which is made up of patterns of behavior. The word patterns is important because it reminds us that a few behaviors do not create the communication climate. However, extensive and frequent use of those behaviors does. Gibb identified 6 patterns of behavior that tend to create defensive communication climates and 6 contrasting patterns that tend to create supportive climates. We'll start with the defensive patterns. These are the behaviors that tend to create defensiveness in one or both of the participants in a relationship. The first defensive pattern is evaluation, where we feel people are judging us, blaming us, telling us what we do wrong, and treating us with contempt. This can be communicated verbally with words like, "You are so lazy," or non-verbally with a look, tone of voice, sigh, etc. Keep in mind that some situations call for evaluation. If you are a supervisor at your job, for example. But there are ways to phrase evaluations to get the point across without diminishing the other person's sense of self-worth. We tend to be more sensitive to negative feedback than positive feedback, and oftentimes it matters who criticizes us, as well as what we are being criticized for. And when we feel we are being evaluated, we get defensive. The second pattern is control, which is when we feel someone is making us do something that they want us to do because they can. When someone tells us what to do, we may think, well, who is he to tell me that? And the more someone tries to control us and limit our choices, the more we tend to fight back, especially if we feel entitled to our freedom to choose. If you've ever had someone tell you, don't think of an elephant, you may have experienced the need to fight against that command. You can't seem to help but think of an elephant, and the harder you try, the more you think about it. This can also refer to who controls the conversation. If someone dominates or interrupts, we feel they have taken control, and that defensiveness kicks in. Now the third defensive pattern, strategy, isn't quite so obvious. Gibb wasn't referring to thinking strategically as in what would happen if, but manipulation. How do you feel when you find out that you have been or are being manipulated? Or if you think there could be a hidden agenda, you may ask yourself, what does this person really want, and how is that person going to go about getting it, and will I get hurt in the process? Oftentimes the mere thought that someone might be manipulating us can put us on the defensive. We think they are lying, and we don't feel we can trust what they have to say. Neutrality also needs some explanation. Another way to describe this is apathy, a lack of concern, indifference, or the impression that the other person doesn't really care about us, who we are, or what we think. We like to be acknowledged, and when that doesn't happen, we get defensive. How do you feel when someone addresses you with a superior than thou attitude? It may be the nonverbal, it may be the words they use, but they make us feel like we are beneath them, generating that defensive reaction. The last defensive communication pattern is certainty. Another word for this is dogmatism, the belief in the self-evident truth of one's opinion. A person who is dogmatic is very closed-minded and inflexible. There is no room for debate. When someone implies that he or she knows the right answer, and obviously if we have a different answer, we are wrong, misinformed, or sometimes just stupid, we get defensive. We may back down and act contrite, but oftentimes our immediate instinct is to prove that person wrong, even in those rare instances when we know we are actually wrong. We tend to fight harder to prove our arguments. Gibb also identified 6 supportive communication patterns that can be used to both create a supportive climate if you were the sender of the message and to counter a defensive communication behavior if you're on the receiving end. To counteract evaluation, Gibb recommends using description, which is describing a behavior instead of evaluating it. You may think, wow, that was rude, which is evaluative. But ask yourself what the behavior was that made you come to that conclusion. That is what you describe, the behavior. So instead you might say, I'm concerned that you didn't respond to my messages when you said you would. Or, I've noticed that you've been late to work 3 times this week. You can become more descriptive by offering praise before you describe, as long as the praise is appropriate. And use I statements rather than you or we statements when you own your own feelings. This makes it difficult for others to argue with you or deny your feelings. It allows them to save face by thinking, well, that's just your opinion. And be specific, not vague. I feel let down when you're not here when you say you will be. Remember that there is more to communication than just the words. Your nonverbal must be consistent. So pay attention to your facial expressions, eye contact, and tone of voice. A sarcastic attitude can undermine all the effort you put into using descriptive language, turning it into evaluation and putting the other person on the defensive. To counteract control, aim for a problem orientation. Focus on the problem, separating it from the person. What's the problem if someone is late? The office doesn't get open on time. So rather than attacking or blaming the person, attack the problem. Rather than ordering, offer a variety of suggestions, implying or directly requesting feedback and other ideas. And then perhaps you can collaborate to find an effective solution. Remember that Gibb's term strategy can be thought of as manipulation or dishonesty. Gibb offers spontaneity or genuineness and honesty, assertiveness as the contrasting behavior. In general, honesty is the best policy, but don't use honesty as an excuse to tell people hurtful information that they don't need to know. Be direct and straightforward, transparent. While some people might be offended in the beginning, most would rather be around someone who is direct and honest than someone who is not. And make sure that you don't have any hidden agendas. To combat neutrality, use empathy. As neutrality, or indifference, contributes to defensiveness, acknowledge the other person. Respond emotionally to another person's feelings and try to understand the situation from their perspective. Demonstrate that you value their opinions. Even if you don't actually agree with them or can't do what they want, you still value them. Be other-oriented, which is thinking and feeling what you perceive another to be thinking and feeling. Instead of implying superiority, strive to communicate that you are equals and acknowledge that each of you have areas of expertise. Respect others until they give you a reason otherwise. Treat others as you would like them to treat you. Be polite. If you don't like to feel stupid, and who does, don't make them feel stupid. Try not to treat people differently because of any variabilities in age, gender, talent, etc. Minimize status differences. You may be the boss or the parent, but you don't have to lord it over people. It's important to pay attention to your nonverbals here because more often than not, it's not what you say, but how you say it. And don't set people up to fail so that you can feel superior. Rather than claiming certainty, use provisionalism. Provisionalism is being flexible and allowing for other points of view. It suggests some tentativeness in presenting ideas and allows you to remain open to possibilities and options that you may not have explored. Some ways of being provisionalist include letting others speak. Don't dominate and don't interrupt. Encourage others to contribute to the conversation. Who knows? You may learn something. Consider the remote possibility that you could be wrong. It's possible, really. And use provisional wording. One example of provisional wording includes prefacing a statement with a qualifier, such as I think or from my perspective. You can also date generalizations, the last time I looked or 3 months ago. Indexing generalizations is providing a comparison, such as compared to our last bill, this one is much higher. What can you do with all this information? First, understand the concept of reciprocal patterns. Like begets like. What you say or do can influence other people, and what they say or do can influence you. If you engage in supportive communication, it increases the likelihood that the other will respond supportively. Conversely, defensive communication can lead to more defensive communication. Communication patterns can spiral. While a supportive spiral may be great, a defensive spiral, where defensiveness causes defensiveness, which causes more defensiveness, can easily get out of hand. As humans, we have the ability to engage in self-reflexiveness, which means we can think about what we are experiencing while we are experiencing it. So when you are engaged in communication, pay attention to both the verbal and nonverbal messages. Ask yourself several questions, such as, what specifically are the behaviors you and your partner are engaging in? If they indicate a defensive pattern, what can you do to counteract that behavior? And might you perhaps be misinterpreting the message? Think, if you needed to say the same thing, would you have communicated it differently? If the answer is no, perhaps you shouldn't be defensive. Take a hard look at yourself in the mirror. Might you be the one or one of the ones communicating using defensive patterns? For example, might you have a habit of communicating certainty, non-verbally emphasizing your status or superiority? Habits are essentially patterns of behavior that become worn into our brains, and they are easier to make than to break. Robert Pullen, an English theologian credited with founding Oxford University, observed, "Good habits, once established, are just as hard to break as are bad habits." If you've gotten into the bad habit of communicating in a manner that puts people on the defensive, work on establishing new habits. On the other hand, could you be supporting or enabling someone else's defensive patterns? For example, I tend to apologize a lot, which implies that I am to blame, even for things I might have no control over. My husband might say, "I'm late because I had to put gas in the car," and I'll respond with, "I'm sorry." That automatically puts me in a defensive frame of mind. And could you work on improving your self-esteem? If you feel good about yourself, you might be able to shrug off some stinging comments. And finally, it might be time to evaluate the relationship. Is it worth saving or maintaining? If, for example, you are working in a toxic work environment and, understanding the concept of reciprocal patterns, you have tried everything you can to counteract the defensive communication patterns, perhaps it's time to look for another job. If, however, you are stuck in a defensive climate, understanding what is occurring might make it easier to tolerate. Processing time. Can you explain the difference between defensive and supportive communication patterns? If your partner is using the evaluation communication pattern, what pattern would you use to try to counteract it? And what can you do to improve the communication climates in your relationships? Finally, we can learn something from Lady Dorothy Nevill, who was an English writer, hostess, horticulturist, and plant collector in the 1800s. She observed that the real art of conversation is not only to say the right thing at the right time, but also to leave unsaid the wrong thing at the tempting moment.